everyone, welcome back to Zilog and Moto, where, in the words of the immortal queen, the show must go on, despite the current craziness that we find ourselves in. And it does still go on. eBay is still a thing, and the collection continues to grow, even if I don't get to go out and look for the games myself right now. Not the worst thing in the world, but I do miss that anticipation of going to a shop or a convention and finding something I didn't previously have. And there's still about 600 titles I've yet to get for these 4 systems, so the search definitely continues to go on. After looking at the Genesis for the last 2 weeks, this week I decided to go back to the Sega CD for the second time this year and check out a game from a genre that I haven't looked at yet in the previous 59 episodes. There are still a few I haven't hit yet, believe it or not. The genre at hand this week is the adventure game, and the title is The Adventures of Willy Beamish. Most of the time this genre is a little more thoroughly described as the point-and-click adventure game genre, but the Sega mouse isn't exactly the most common accessory in the world, and The Adventures of Willy Beamish isn't one of the 27 games that support it anyway, seeing as how the Sega mouse was released 4 months after Willy Beamish hit the United States. I guess we'll just have to make do with a regular controller, which is fine, but does cause some issues that we'll get to later on in the review. The Adventures of Willy Beamish, as stated, is an adventure game originally developed by Dynamix in 1991 for DOS-based PCs and published by adventure game powerhouse Sierra Online, famous publisher of the Leisure Suit Larry series, Space Quest, King's Quest, Police Quest, etc. and on and on. If anyone could produce a quality point-and-click adventure title in the late 80s and early 90s, it was Sierra, with also a tip of the cap to LucasArts. This original release of Willy Beamish was also ported to the Amiga and Macintosh, as was relatively common, but Sierra wasn't done. Just like with the Sega CD, the early 90s was the dawn of the multimedia era on home computers, which meant that all of a sudden existing games were ripe for enhanced editions, featuring in-game speech and improved audio. Sierra actually released talkie and regular editions of a few of their games from this period, to appeal to the users that had plunked down the money for the fancy new disk drives, and in some cases significantly added to the sales of games, like with Freddie Farkas' Frontier Pharmacist adding 200,000 copies sold. Willy Beamish received one of these enhanced editions in 1992, and it's from this edition that the Sega CD version was born. So, with this version being based on the enhanced edition, it's gotta be good, right? Well, to borrow a phrase, not so fast, my friend. Just because the Sega CD features a CD-ROM drive, that does not magically turn it into a full-fledged multimedia PC. So, what went wrong then? And just how bad is it? And was The Adventures of Willy Beamish even worth investing any time into to begin with, regardless of the vision you pick up? Well, we'll go over all the damage, and on a positive note, it's not all bad news. There are at least some mildly interesting things here that I'll discuss. Having said all that, let's get right to it and take a look at the package. And here is The Adventures of Willy Beamish, and as you can immediately see, this is one of the, I believe, 22 early releases for the Sega CD that was released in a cardboard box rather than the larger jewel case format that appeared later on. Some games like Night Trap appeared in both versions, but Willy Beamish was definitely not one of those, so if you choose to seek out this title, this is what you're looking for. The box itself is in relatively good shape for its age. It's certainly not perfect, and you can immediately see some wear, especially in the corners, but that's all pretty expected on an almost 30-year-old cardboard box. One thing that these type of boxes is very susceptible to is crush damage, and we saw a little of that previously with the Make My Video Marky Mark in episode 49, but thankfully none of that is present here, and the box is fully structurally sound. As far as front covers go, this is actually a pretty great cover. I like it a lot. The logo for The Adventures of Willy Beamish is pretty great, and I like how the yellow really makes it pop on the silver background. And then the art below is very nice. Illustrates the character of Willy and his frog Horny. Oh yes, we'll get to that later. On his skateboard very well, and makes the game look like something straight out of a cartoon. I'm not so sure about the pea soup green that they used for the borders on the front and back. I know it's supposed to represent sludge from
in the game, except the sludge in the game is brown rather than green. I mean, it stands out at least. It's certainly not the most inviting color ever. One last thing that you might miss if you're not looking closely are the white insets on both sides of Willy, and if you look, you'll see that they're filled with design sketches of various in-game characters, like the coach, the babysitter, your mom, your dad, your sister, etc. I like seeing the behind-the-scenes stuff from where these games came from, and it's interesting to see that rather than final polished images that might distract from the rest of the cover. Flipping over to the back, and holy ridiculously tiny font, Batman! Seriously, as I was writing up this section, I had the game about a foot from my face on my desk, and I couldn't read anything on the back other than the tagline at the top and the fact that it's one player at the bottom. Not sure that we really need the one-player designation for an adventure game, but okay. When you actually get to bring the box in close enough to look at, the screenshots aren't bad, although they definitely picked one of the better cutscene shots in the middle to try to make the game look better than it actually does. And also, I've got a feeling that's why all three of these are so small, to minimize how rough the game looks in places. The flavor text in the pool of sludge is fine, but even the bullet points are so small, good luck reading any of that. Not sure what they were thinking here, but with as well designed as the front cover is, the back is just a disaster. Opening the box up, and the game disc is in a plain jewel case as you would expect for one of these early releases, and then we've got the manual, which has got a few dings in the cover, but it's more or less intact. The manual starts out with an intro from Willy, and then goes into fully explaining how to play the game, and then even has a quick reference section toward the end, which basically just restates everything you just read in a briefer format. Seems a bit redundant to me, but my major bone to pick is that they listed pay-per-minute hint lines right at the beginning of the manual. I'm good with them being in the manual, but come on, put that stuff towards the end, because otherwise it really just looks like you're trying to make a quick buck off of kids that have already paid money for the game. One quick other note about the manual, and that's something I didn't catch my first time playing the game, is this random note in here about hypnotism. This is actually a clue for a puzzle pretty late in the game, and you can beat the game without this note, but it's definitely more frustrating, and it's close to being an old school copy protection mechanism. So, don't forget about this when it comes time to hypnotize someone. Okay, that's enough about the package. Let's get to the game. As I mentioned earlier, The Adventures of Willy Beamish is a port of the enhanced version of the DOS release. Point-and-click adventures tend to always at least start out with some form of home computer edition before making it to consoles, with a few notable exceptions like Scooby-Doo Mystery on the Genesis, and that's for good reason. The games simply work better when you can use a mouse to control the on-screen action. While using a D-pad on a controller in theory should give you a similar experience, ultimately it doesn't do the difference in accuracy and movement speed between a mouse and a regular game controller. While Willy Beamish is fully playable on the Sega CD using a standard controller, and I specifically used the 6 button for this review, it is significantly more difficult and frustrating, a theme that you will see repeat several times, to play the game and try to solve puzzles when using a controller versus a mouse on the PC. For full disclosure, the enhanced DOS version of The Adventures of Willy Beamish was re-released for the Windows via DOSBox emulation on Good Old Games back in 2017. And when I compare the Sega CD release versus the PC version, this 2017 version is the one I'm referring to. While a mouse will almost always be more responsive speed-wise than a controller, this actually didn't cause much of an issue in playing the game, and that makes sense since it's an adventure game, and many things in the game aren't directly time-sensitive. Although, the few that are, well, good luck, as they're tricky even on the PC. Where things tend to fall apart instead on the Sega CD version in regards to control actually has to do more with precision issues. A point-and-click adventure game succeeds or fails based on your ability to point and or click. I know that sounds stupid and elementary, but it's the truth. You can have all the weird, nonsensical puzzles in the world, but as long as you can fully interact with everything in the game that you're supposed to, then the rest of the game, stories, characters, humor, etc., all builds on that. In the port over to the Sega CD from the PC, something seemed to happen with being able to click on things. It just doesn't work all the time. The biggest example of this is anytime you need to get something out of your backpack. If you have to do it in a quick manner due to an in-game situation, well, again, good luck. Also, this is specifically an issue with the port. Controlling the game on the PC version is a dream in comparison. I think the designers knew this because at some point a feature was added to the Sega CD version to where if you hit the A button, it will automatically move the cursor to all the hotspots on the screen that you can interact with. Sort of. See, while it moves the cursor around between things you can pick up, it doesn't highlight all the things you can look at. Less important, I know, but if they were going to implement this function, I don't understand why they didn't just do it for all objects. Also, the bigger problem is how this function actually works. Pressing the A button does auto-highlight items to interact with, including exits, but it also moves between them rapidly. So if you're going to use this option, you have to try to use the A button very gently, or else the cursor will more than likely not end up pointing to what you want it to, defeating the whole purpose. Two interesting game features did actually make the port over intact. The first one is Willy's behavior meter. Willy, being an average precocious 9-year-old, had a tendency to either do or say things to get himself in trouble. And actually, in that regard, Willy strikes me as sort of a modern day, or I guess modern day 30 years ago, Dennis the Menace, minus a specific Mr. Wilson to annoy. But the thing about Willy, or Dennis, is that they aren't specifically bad kids, they just do things they shouldn't sometimes, like a lot of 9-year-olds. To keep up with that, the game has a behavior meter, similar to a thermometer, that goes up anytime Willy acts or says something inappropriate. Cause the meter to blow its top, and it's game over and off to military school with Willy. I believe it's also possible to do good things, allowing you to counterbalance any mistakes, or on-purpose impulses, but in playing through the game multiple times, I only found one instance where this occurred. I feel like they really could have done more with this, possibly had multiple endings depending on how good or a bad kid you were throughout the game, but in essence it really just serves as a governor for the next feature I'm going to discuss, which is time. The entire game of The Adventures of Willy Beamish takes place over a 4-day period, starting with a Friday that serves as the last school day of the year, following with Saturday and Sunday, and then climaxing with the first Monday of summer break. To accomplish this, the game has a running clock. Every action you take in game takes time off the clock, and if you just sit around looking at things or thinking, time runs as well. You can always check what time it is by going into your backpack, and if you find yourself ahead of schedule, as certain events happen in each time every day, like needing to be home for dinner or go to bed, you can have the game advance the clock in 1-hour increments, with it automatically stopping in time for the next game event. On the one hand, I like this as it puts a bit of pressure on the player to keep moving and not just mess around, but on the other hand, it's nice to be able to just relax and explore the world at your own pace. I think I would prefer having time pass via in-game sequences only versus a running clock, but I'm not going to ding the game for that design choice, as I can definitely see the upside as well, and as I referenced earlier, it does feed into your behavior meter if you're dawdling too much. I mentioned earlier that at times, Willy can say things that are inappropriate and get himself in trouble. This is one of the ways how you can tell this isn't a straight Sierra adventure game, as once Sierra went the full graphical route to their games, dialogue just kind of happened in-game, and there were no choices of how conversations would go. This instead leans more LucasArts, as we'll see when we get to the Secret of Monkey Island. In that vein, Willy Beamish has some dialogue choices that are inconsequential and can be just chosen for laughs, but then there are also some choices that directly affect whether you survive or get a game over screen. All I can say is, save often until you really learn your way through the game, or else you might be replaying significant bits of the game due to one wrong choice. At its core, the enhanced PC version of The Adventure of Willy Beamish is a decent point-and-click adventure game that suffers from some vague puzzles and oddly sophomoric bits that I'm not sure belong in a game about a 9-year-old, such as him having a frog named Horny, a quite voluptuous blonde school nurse, and a scene that involves his teenage sister naked in the bathtub, to name a few. However, that's the PC version. Problem is we're talking about the Sega CD version, and it's clear that this was not a direct port. Earlier I complained a bit about how the point-and-click system just seemed off. Compounding that problem is the fact that the in-game graphics have lost a significant amount of detail in the conversion, making them duller and harder to determine what in the various scenes should be clicked on. I was expecting a bit of loss of detail due to the developers having to drop the game from 256 colors on the PC down to 64 colors on the Sega CD, but sometimes it seems more than just a lack of color. Sometimes the scenes appear to be redrawn completely, with crappier results. Going hand in hand with the drop in details is a dramatic drop in frames of animation. Even small things like Dana and Perry throwing their empty cans of soda cause the Sega CD to lurch horribly, with sound effects playing that don't necessarily match the on-screen action. This seems to be just bad programming rather than an actual console limitation, as during research for this review I've read of people emulating the game on much faster systems, and the lurching is still present. It makes me wonder had the game come out later in the Sega CD's lifespan if it would be better optimized, but that's neither here nor there. I understand the Sega CD is limited to a single speed CD-ROM, but damn! It definitely takes you out of the game when you're having to wait for things to happen. One thing that should have gotten better in the port from PC to Sega CD is the audio. And in some cases, the audio is better in the Sega CD version, at least as far as audio tracks are concerned. New in the Sega CD is a rocking intro track that is meant to replace an intro dream sequence that was cut from the PC version of Willy at the Atari Championships. And that new intro song is nice. Also, the rest of the background tracks sound livelier on the Sega CD, and there are a few sound effects that have been significantly improved on the Sega CD, including one WOOOO that gets used a few times in-game that makes me laugh stupidly each time, and I'm sure I did a terrible version of it there, so just go and look for it and you'll understand what I'm saying. But, and you knew there was a but coming, the in-game speech quality has been compressed all to hell. I checked the size of the CD and it's only about half full, so there was plenty of space remaining for the full quality speech found on the PC version. So what gives? All I can figure is that since the higher quality speech would take more memory, it would have made the in-scene loading issues even worse than they already are, so a sacrifice had to be made to keep the game somewhat playable. However, this inadvertently leads to another issue where because the speech is so compressed, it makes it unintelligible. This wouldn't be an issue in any of the other versions of the game because they all feature on-screen dialogue for all speech, so even if you can't understand what's being said, you could at least read it. But, of course, this had to be removed from the Sega CD version as well. So, as you can probably tell if you've been paying attention, I don't exactly have the highest opinion of the Sega CD version of Willy Beamish, but here is the cherry on this shit sundae. The loading times in the game are atrocious, going from scene to scene, etc., which makes the trial and error approach that you have to take in point-and-click games very frustrating. But I managed to struggle through and get about halfway through the last day, and my game froze. Reloaded, froze again at the same point. Cleaned the disk, still froze. Tried a backup image of the game on a fresh CD, still froze. Ended up Googling the issue, and I did manage to find a few others that had this exact same issue occur, with apparently no fix even when different models of Sega CD were used, and the assumption being that perhaps one of the disc pressings had an issue from the factory. This is when I went from being mildly disappointed to full-on F this game territory. So because of that, I'm giving The Adventures of Willy Beamish on Sega CD a 1 star out of 5, and that 1 star only assuming you can find a copy of the game that doesn't freeze. Seriously, if you want to play this game, go to Good Old Games and purchase the PC version. It's all of $5.99, and you can play the game as the way it was designed to be played.
Alright, that was The Adventures of Willy Beamish, and I think you can see why a lot of point-and-click games don't make it over to consoles. Anytime completing a game is challenging due to outside factors rather than actual gameplay, it's just not worth the frustration. I try to frame these games from the perspective of the era they were released in, and a multimedia PC to play the enhanced version of Willy Beamish was far more expensive than a Sega CD in 1992, so if the game was even close and not featuring a game-breaking glitch at the end, I think I would have given it some more slack. But Infinite Laserdog, who ported this game for Dynamix, and coincidentally only worked on one other game in their history, Stellar Fire, just did not get the job done here. Tune in next week when I take a look at another recent acquisition and the second European exclusive Mega Drive game so far on Zilog and Moto. Fun fact, this game is pretty infamous, and I actually had no idea it was a European exclusive until a few weeks ago. I just assumed it was released for the Genesis because of all the other consoles it was released for in the United States. I'm hoping I don't have back-to-back one-star games on my hands, but maybe? Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.